Self-managed option. The self-managed option was created mainly as a result of the very limited management company passport applicable to UCITS managers. Before UCITS 4, in order to go for this option, you had to have the manager being based in the same domicile of the UCITS. And we all know that Luxembourg is a powerhouse for UCITS, but all the managers of UCITS are surely not based in Luxembourg or in Ireland. They are typically based in London or in Germany or in other centers. And in that case, they had to either follow the model where they engage a Luxembourg or an Irish UCITS management company, or a Maltese ultimately if the UCITS is in Malta, and then the UCITS management company based in the same domicile of the fund had to outsource to the sub-investment manager. That was one option, but that was quite expensive to implement because you had to pay a fee to the UCITS manager for like fronting the structure, for assuming responsibility for the acts and omissions of the delegates, or else they could go for this option, which is the self-managed option. The self-managed option, although still popular, is naturally losing traction in view of the management company passport under UCITS 4 because you can easily now passport the management function into the country of the fund. But the self-managed option is still used and quite popular because the self-managed option allows the UCITS to engage a manager based anywhere, not necessarily in its same domicile. And the manager does not necessarily have to qualify as a UCITS management company under the UCITS directive. So if you have a London-based hedge fund management company, which is not a UCITS management company, in that case, surely this model is probably the more attractive one, where you have the self-managed UCITS assuming responsibility for high-level management, investment management, and risk management, and outsourcing the rest to third-party regulated delegates. So under this typical structure, you'd have a board, an investment committee made up of 3 members. The board needs to have at least 1 member that is resident in Malta, and the investment committee likewise needs to have at least 1 Maltese resident member. The investment committee assumes a monitoring role over the fund manager in terms of the implementation of the policy of the fund. And ultimately, the day-to-day management is obviously done at this level. The committee meets on a quarterly basis. It receives detailed reports from the manager, but ultimately 95% of the work is done at this level. The self-managed UCITS is also required to assume responsibility for risk management within the fund. So this is typically satisfied through the engagement of a risk manager. The risk manager, again, would be responsible for the implementation of the risk management policy of the UCITS, but the day-to-day risk management would again be undertaken at this level. The fund manager would typically be the entity which would also handle the day-to-day risk management. And again, an important point that you need to keep in mind here is that for that to be acceptable to the MFSA, the investment management function and the risk management function within the fund manager need to be split. You cannot have the same person undertaking the investment management and the risk management. MFSA would insist that if the manager is undertaking both the investment management and the risk management, the manager must have 2 functionally distinct groups of people handling the investment management and the risk management, rather than everything done by the investment managers. But ultimately, the day-to-day work is always done at this level. In terms of custody, same rules, sub-investment manager, same rules, advisor, same rules. Again, now the main difference here is that the administrator is engaged by the fund rather than by the manager, because the manager would not typically be a UCITS management company, and this contract would typically cover only investment management and risk management, with the administration being something totally separate, undertaken directly by the administrator through an engagement with the fund. So a self-managed UCITS is like a management company and the fund pretty much condensed into one structure. With that structure, then outsourcing the day-to-day investment management and risk management to this entity here, to the fund manager. And again, in terms of ongoing obligations of the MFSA, the ongoing obligations applicable to a structure of this type are much more onerous than the ongoing obligations applicable to a UCITS of the previous type, okay, of the third-party managed UCITS. For the simple reason that they are treating the self-managed UCITS, they are treating the fund and regulating the fund in the same manner as a manager. Okay, so they would expect the self-managed UCITS to have the same procedures and to satisfy the similar requirements to those applicable to a standalone fund management company. So this is pretty much why, obviously, the ongoing obligations here are much more onerous. In terms of the application process, I obviously combined the application process for both the UCITS and the PIF in one overall process, but again, there aren't many differences, but I'll highlight the differences in a second. So the first step is by far making sure that we identify a fund structure which suits the needs of the clients. Ultimately, the clients, being generally the fund managers, always tell us, I want a UCITS. They start off, if they want passporting and stuff like that, they always say, I want a UCITS. But ultimately, we need to make sure that the limitations which a UCITS structure imposes on its operator, on the manager, fits within that strategy. Because we had situations in the past where you have a manager speaking to large insurance or pension funds, and they tell him, but we don't like your hedge fund, but we'd rather invest in a UCITS. So they'll be very keen to set up UCITS structures, but they are a commodity fund, for instance, where it is evident that a UCITS, in terms of its rules, cannot invest in commodity derivatives. So by default, a fund with that objective cannot be set up. So in terms of identifying the right structure, you need to make sure, especially if the client is going for a UCITS, that he really understands the ongoing obligations in terms of investment limits, in terms of leverage limits, that a UCITS structure has inherent in it. So that's the first point. Naturally, setting up a PIF is much easier. No investment limits, no specific investment policies, no leverage limits. We can pretty much put in it whatever we like, generally. And in terms of structuring, it's also quite flexible, at least from here till the 22nd of June of next year. So the first step is surely identifying the right structure for the client. The second step is actually drawing the structure, agreeing the structure with the client, and then drafting the documentation in accordance with that structure. The structure of a fund is probably the most important decision that the manager will have to take throughout the process. And once you get the structure right, you're really 50% there. Because then the next steps are pretty much checking the box and making sure that whatever you draft reflects the structure that you've agreed with the client. Changing the structure midway a project means delays and a lot of redrafting. So it is important that the client and yourselves dedicate sufficient time to the structure in order to make sure that you've really assessed all possible implications that it may have for the client, and that ultimately the structure you're proposing fits within the investment strategy, the investment policy of the client. Then we need to prepare the application form, the prospectus. If it's a UCITS, we need to work on the KID, the M&A, the resolutions. So all that stuff is pretty much prepared over a course of a week and a half or so. The next step would be sending the documents to the client for comments, and then naturally you may have a couple of conference calls until you agree a first draft, which is good enough to go to the MFSA, which leads us to step 4, which is filing the application with the regulator. And step 5, we would typically at this stage start working on the contracts, which means drafting or reviewing the management agreement, the administration agreement, the custody or prime brokerage agreements, any ISDA agreements or credit support annexes and master confirms and the likes that the fund might enter into with its counterparty. And filing with the MFSA if necessary, and we only need to file agreements if we are setting up a UCITS fund or a retail non-UCITS fund. If it's a PIF, we don't need to file any contracts with the regulator. But if we need to, because we're setting up a retail structure, then we need to follow step 6. Step 7, at this stage, we would start working on the director services contracts, on the investment committee services contracts, speak to the auditors and to the tax advisors to get the letters of engagements prepared. We'll start preparing our own letter of engagement and preparing pretty much for the launch board meeting of the fund, during which all these documents would be approved. Next step would be, within probably 3 to 4 weeks, receiving the first comments from the regulator. And typically these comments are very comprehensive. The average length of the letter will probably be 9 pages, so don't get scared if you get a 9 or 10-page letter. It's becoming very common lately, so that's fine. And at that stage, you start updating the documentation to reflect the comments from the MFSA. Again, you send the updated documentation to the client, and at that stage, it's where you resubmit, once you've agreed the revisions with the client, you resubmit to the regulator. This process will probably take another a good 2 weeks.